It was a quiet morning at the Capitol, and for most members of the press, it felt like any other day. Karoline Leavitt, now a familiar face among conservative media circles and former spokesperson for Donald Trump, was scheduled to hold a press briefing. These events were typically straightforward talking points on the economy, responses to criticism of Trump-era policies, and subtle jabs at the Biden administration. Nothing out of the ordinary was expected. The press corps showed up, coffee in hand, cameras rolling, already predicting what sound bites they might hear. But the mood shifted the moment Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett appeared. Crockett wasn't on the schedule. She hadn't been announced. She hadn't even alerted her staff that she'd be making an appearance. But she entered the press room with the kind of quiet authority that didn't require warning. Dressed sharply in her signature style, Crockett walked past reporters without acknowledging them, her gaze focused and firm. Her presence was calm, but intentional, and that alone turned heads. Leavitt noticed immediately. As she stepped up to the podium, she glanced briefly at Crockett, seated just 2 rows from the front. The Congresswoman didn't speak. She simply sat, flipping through a small leather-bound notebook, occasionally underlining something with a pen. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a coincidence. But to the seasoned journalists in the room, it felt like a setup, like something was brewing behind that composed exterior. Leavitt opened with talking points about the southern border and inflation. She spoke with the ease of someone used to commanding a room, offering stats, quotes, and a few light digs at the Democratic leadership. The audience listened politely. Some reporters jotted notes, others typed directly into their laptops. Crockett, however, didn't move. She listened carefully, expression unreadable. Then came the question. A reporter from The Hill asked about recently uncovered financial documents alleging that foreign governments had wired significant payments to companies linked to Donald Trump during his presidency. Was a loaded topic, one that had been circulating in the background for weeks but hadn't yet taken center stage. Leavitt responded without hesitation. The American people are tired of rehashed political witch hunts, she said. These are the same tired accusations we've heard for years, none of which have ever produced evidence of wrongdoing. Crockett raised her hand. Before Leavitt could call on another reporter, the Congresswoman stood. No microphone, no raised voice, just calm, measured words. You say it's rehashed, but these aren't old headlines, Karoline. These are financial records released just last week, documents showing payments from entities tied to countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE wired directly to Trump-affiliated companies while he was still in office. Leavitt blinked. The tone of the room changed. Some reporters stopped typing. Others leaned forward. With respect, Congresswoman Leavitt said, her voice slightly more controlled. I'm here today to speak on behalf of voters who are focused on the future, not old distractions. Crockett took a step closer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even interrupt. It's not a distraction if it concerns national security, she replied. The man you defend held the highest office in the land. The American people have a right to know if his decisions were influenced by foreign money. And you, Karoline, have a responsibility to answer to that, not pivot away. The silence in the room was palpable. No one expected this. It wasn't a scheduled debate, and Crockett wasn't listed as a participant. But her presence had completely transformed the dynamic. This wasn't a press briefing anymore. It was a confrontation, one that Leavitt hadn't prepared for. Crockett's ability to shift the atmosphere without theatrics was what made the moment resonate. She didn't grandstand or yell. She didn't accuse Leavitt of being corrupt or dishonest. Instead, she calmly referenced facts, recent disclosures, and the core question of political accountability. It wasn't personal, it was institutional. That's what made it so effective. By entering unannounced and calmly questioning the narrative, Crockett turned a routine press event into a pivotal moment, one that left Karoline visibly uncomfortable. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to the press room looking for a shouting match. That wasn't her style. She came prepared with documents, dates, and a calm but firm demeanor that signaled she was there to talk facts. And when the moment came, she didn't waste time on sweeping accusations or emotional appeals. She focused entirely on one thing: substance. When Karoline Leavitt dismissed a reporter's question about the latest financial disclosures involving Donald Trump, branding it old news and another witch hunt. Many in the room expected the conversation to move on. That's how it usually went. Controversial topics were brushed aside, and follow-up questions rarely stuck. But this time was different. And it was different because Crockett wasn't interested in letting that moment slide. She waited until Leavitt wrapped up her response, then stood and calmly walked to the front. The room, already buzzing from the earlier exchange, fell quiet again. Cameras panned toward her. Crockett wasn't looking to score points. She was there to get answers. Karoline, she began, her voice steady. You keep referring to these latest documents as rehashed, but these filings weren't available a month ago. They were released last week through court orders and FOIA requests. So, help me understand, how do you call that old news? Leavitt opened her mouth, then paused. Crockett continued. She held up a folder thick with printouts. These include international wire transfers tied directly to Trump Organization accounts, payments from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, transactions routed through real estate subsidiaries in the United Arab Emirates. These weren't campaign donations, they weren't speaking fees, they were payments to businesses still owned by a sitting president. A hush settled over the room. She didn't call Trump corrupt. She didn't accuse him of treason. What she did was much more effective. She named facts, named sources, and gave Karoline Leavitt nowhere to hide behind rhetoric. Leavitt tried to respond. Look, I respect your passion, Congresswoman, but none of these so-called findings prove any illegal activity. Trump was a businessman before and after his presidency. That's not a crime. Crockett didn't flinch. It's not about what's illegal, it's about what's ethical, what's transparent. We're talking about a president who didn't divest from his businesses, whose hotels and properties hosted foreign officials while he was in office. And now we're seeing the payments in black and white. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. This wasn't just another partisan clash. It was a rare moment of real engagement on an issue that often got lost in headlines. Crockett wasn't just trying to own Leavitt, she was outlining a case, the way a prosecutor would in court. She laid out motive, means, and evidence, and she did it without grandstanding. She went further, to mentioning how these payments were part of a broader concern raised not just by Democrats, but by watchdog groups and bipartisan ethics committees. She cited the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington crew, who had documented hundreds of foreign transactions connected to Trump's properties during his presidency. She noted how diplomats from countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey had been encouraged to stay at Trump hotels, sometimes at inflated rates, during sensitive negotiations with the U.S. This isn't a partisan attack, Crockett said. This is about influence. Foreign governments saw a chance to curry favor and they took it. And we have every reason to believe those efforts were successful. The substance of her argument struck a nerve. Leavitt, clearly frustrated, repeated familiar lines. The media is obsessed with Trump. Americans are focused on the economy, not recycled allegations. But Crockett didn't take the bait. Nobody's recycling anything, she replied. We're unpacking what was hidden. What's finally coming to light now that the documents are public. You say Americans care about the economy? Don't you think they care whether their president was profiting off foreign interests while negotiating trade deals with those same countries? Again, the room went still. Crockett's delivery wasn't emotional. It was matter-of-fact, grounded, and clear. She wasn't there to paint Trump as the villain of a dramatic story. She was there to ask why the facts on the table were being ignored, and why Leavitt, someone who once stood behind the official White House seal, was refusing to acknowledge them. It wasn't showmanship that made Crockett's confrontation effective. It was precision. She zeroed in on the issue at hand: foreign money, ethical conflicts, and the absence of transparency. She didn't stray into unrelated scandals or political insults. She stuck to what could be proved, and that made it impossible to brush her off. As soon as the questions turned serious, Karoline Leavitt's tone shifted. Up until that point, she had maintained her usual confidence, fielding questions with prepared talking points, redirecting conversations, and even offering a few sarcastic quips that had some conservative-leaning reporters chuckling. But when Jasmine Crockett pressed her on the Trump financial records, Leavitt's composure began to waver. She tried to hold the line, defending the former president, deflecting questions, and attempting to paint the controversy as yet another partisan smear. But this time, the facts were fresh, the questions were pointed, and the person asking them wasn't going to be waved off easily. The moment became unmistakable when, rather than respond further, Karoline Leavitt simply walked away. She didn't announce the end of the press conference in the usual, composed manner. There was no polite, "That's all for today." Instead, after Crockett presented a direct question asking whether Leavitt would acknowledge that Trump had failed to separate his presidential duties from his private financial interests, Leavitt hesitated, glanced at her aides, and abruptly stepped back from the podium. The movement was quick, deliberate. She didn't fumble or trip, but there was no mistaking it. She was leaving the room rather than answering. Reporters called out, hoping for a final comment. Cameras continued rolling, capturing her expression tight-lipped, slightly flushed, and clearly flustered. Her team tried to redirect the moment, ushering her through a side exit, while one aide addressed the reporters. "We'll have a written statement later this afternoon." But the damage was already done. What made the exit so striking wasn't that it was loud or chaotic, it was that it was so clear. Karoline Leavitt, a seasoned media figure and longtime defender of Donald Trump, had no answer ready when confronted directly about the newly released financial records connecting Trump's businesses to foreign governments. She had been asked a simple question. Did she believe that accepting money from countries the U.S. was negotiating with posed a conflict of interest for a sitting president? Rather than respond, she left. Too many in the room. It wasn't just a physical exit, it was symbolic. For months, Leavitt had been one of Trump's most vocal defenders. She routinely framed questions about his past conduct as nothing more than political theater. Yet here, presented with data that hadn't existed during previous investigations, bank transfers, corporate filings, foreign invoices, she didn't push back. She didn't explain. She walked. Jasmine Crockett remained at the front, still holding the same folder of documents, visibly unfazed by Leavitt's departure. She turned to the reporters, many of whom were still recording, and said plainly, "That right there is the response. You ask for accountability, and they leave. But Americans don't get to walk away from this stuff. They live with the consequences." The press room buzzed with conversation. Journalists whispered to each other, some already typing out breaking alerts, others watching the footage back on their screens. The clip of Leavitt walking off broadcast in real time was quickly circulated online. It didn't take long before it was clipped, captioned, and dissected by political commentators. To supporters of Crockett and critics of Trump. The exit read like an admission and acknowledgement that Leavitt couldn't defend what had now entered the public record. To Trump allies, it was spun differently, that the event had been hijacked, that it wasn't a fair setup. But regardless of interpretation, the image of Karoline Leavitt walking off the stage while Jasmine Crockett stood calmly, with evidence in hand, struck a chord. It wasn't just about optics, it was about contrast. One woman stood her ground, equipped with hard data, willing to engage. The other, despite years of media training and countless interviews, made the decision to remove herself entirely rather than answer a question that cut to the heart of the controversy. And while Karoline's team would later issue a statement doubling down on her earlier talking points, insisting that there was no evidence of improper influence or illegal conduct on the part of Donald Trump, the moment had already become the story. It wasn't just what she said or didn't say, it was that she chose to say nothing at all, and did so by leaving the conversation altogether. By the time Karoline Leavitt had left the podium and the press room had begun to settle, the buzz was no longer about the policy points she had attempted to share earlier. It was about the confrontation that had just unfolded and, more specifically, the way Jasmine Crockett had handled it. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't thrown insults, and hadn't demanded a dramatic apology or retraction. Instead, she had done something far more effective. She had let the facts do the talking, and in doing so, exposed the weakness in Leavitt's position. The real power of that moment came not from a political jab, but from a refusal to be distracted by Leavitt, like many political figures defending Donald Trump, had mastered the art of redirection. When asked about controversial issues, she would typically shift the focus, bring up Biden's policies, pivot to crime statistics, or make general statements about media bias. But Crockett wasn't interested in that game. She never once mentioned Joe Biden. She didn't bring up partisan divides. She stuck entirely to the subject at hand, the ethics of a president, receiving foreign payments through his private businesses while in office. In a political climate often dominated by outrage and soundbites, Crockett's precision was striking. She referenced specific account numbers, international wire transfers, and official corporate entities tied to the Trump Organization. She noted the timelines of the payments, many of which aligned with periods when U.S. foreign policy decisions were being made. For instance, she pointed out that during a time when the U.S. was negotiating tariffs with China, entities linked to the Chinese government were transferring funds to Trump-owned commercial real estate ventures. That level of detail made it nearly impossible for Leavitt to rely on blanket denials. And yet, rather than confront the evidence or offer a substantive rebuttal, Leavitt dismissed it all as just politics. Before walking out, what followed in the hours after her exit was a stark public reaction, one that spoke volumes. Major news networks replayed the footage of Crockett calmly citing evidence, and Leavitt avoiding the question. Pundits debated whether Leavitt had done permanent damage to her credibility, but outside the Beltway, among regular Americans watching the moment unfold online, the message was clear: when someone has nothing to hide, they don't run. Crockett's approach was especially effective because it was devoid of theater. There were no dramatic gestures or loaded accusations. She didn't claim Trump committed treason, nor did she make the moment about herself. She simply brought the receipts literally, and the absence of political grandstanding only highlighted the contrast between her and Leavitt. Even more, people began sharing clips of the exchange with captions like "This is how you hold someone accountable," and "No yelling, no drama, just facts." On platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and TikTok, Crockett's.com dismantling of Leavitt's narrative gained traction. For younger viewers, especially many of whom had grown weary of the never-ending spectacle of political theater, it was refreshing to see someone deliver truth without turning it into a performance. And the focus remained firmly on Donald Trump, where Crockett had intended it to be. She didn't allow Leavitt to shift the conversation to unrelated culture war topics. She kept bringing it back to one fundamental question: can a sitting president ethically accept large sums of money from foreign governments through businesses he still profits from? Asterisk, that question lingered long after the press conference ended. It was no longer just a partisan issue. It became a broader one about transparency, accountability, and the role of ethics in public service. Crockett had managed to elevate the conversation beyond tribal politics and toward something more foundational. Asterisk, Leavitt's silence in the face of those questions said more than any statement she could have issued. And Crockett didn't have to gloat. She didn't even take a victory lap. Instead, after Leavitt left, she thanked the press for their attention, handed copies of the financial documents to reporters, and walked out quietly. Asterisk, in the political world, that kind of composure is rare. Most public figures would have seized the moment for attention, posted on social media immediately, or issued a press release declaring some kind of win. Crockett didn't. She let the facts and Leavitt's retreat speak for themselves, and in doing so, she reminded everyone that sometimes the most powerful moments in politics come not from outrage, but from clarity. Asterisk. The press conference that was supposed to reinforce Karoline Leavitt's media strategy turned into something entirely different, unexpected reckoning, not with shouting or drama, but with facts that demanded accountability. What unfolded wasn't just a headline or a viral clip. It was a defining moment in the way public figures are now being held to a different standard, one not based on charisma or clever sound bites, but on substance, transparency, and truth. Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett didn't come to embarrass or grandstand. She came to ask legitimate questions backed by verifiable data, and when Karoline Leavitt had the opportunity to address those questions to clarify, defend, or even acknowledge the concerns, she chose to walk away. That decision, more than anything she might have said, left a lasting impression. Asterisk, this wasn't about political affiliation. It wasn't about being pro-Trump or anti-Trump. It was about integrity in leadership. It was about the public's right to know if the highest office in the land was used to benefit private business interests. Crockett brought that issue to the forefront in a way that was calm, clear, and devoid of theatrics, and that's what made it resonate. Asterisk, in an age where attention is often won by volume, Crockett's quiet command of the room was more powerful than any raised voice could have been. She reminded the country that accountability doesn't require anger, it requires persistence, preparation, and courage. And most importantly, she showed that even in today's hyperpolarized environment, it is still possible to bring focus back to facts. Asterisk, for Karoline Leavitt, the choice to exit instead of engage left a vacuum, one quickly filled by public speculation, criticism, and doubt. Her post-event statement tried to reframe the moment, but by then, the image had already been burned into public memory. A poised congresswoman asking fair questions, and a spokesperson walking away rather than answering them. Asterisk, in many ways, this exchange reflected something deeper than a single confrontation. It captured the growing public impatience with evasion and distraction. Voters are tired of the games, the constant finger-pointing, and the refusal to address legitimate concerns. They want clarity, not chaos. And when they saw a leader standing firm on facts while another chose silence, they noticed that asterisk, this moment may not change the course of political alliances overnight, but it adds weight to a conversation that cannot be ignored. It raises a mirror to leadership and asks, who is willing to answer, and who is looking for the exit? Asterisk, Jasmine Crockett asked that question without ever needing to say it out loud, and in her silence, Karoline Leavitt